Thaddeus Ketteridge stood inside the narrow corridor he had built beside his cabin, listening to the wind drag snow across Gravelow Ridge. Through the frosted opening, he watched his neighbors below struggle in the white haze, canvas flapping loose, frozen hands clawing at wet firewood, already turning to smoke. He did not rush. He did not call out. He simply reached behind him, lifted a single split log from his sheltered stack light and dry as bone, and felt its warmth even before it touched the fire. Outside, the storm sharpened. Somewhere in the dark, a child began to cough. At his feet, Muir, the old German shepherd, who never barked without reason, rose, silently, ears forward, waiting. Thad had learned long ago that winter rarely killed with cold, alone. It killed with neglect, with delay, with the belief that things would somehow be fine. This time he was ready long before anyone asked for help. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this still matter to you, consider subscribing. Your support keeps quiet stories like this alive. Morning arrived colorless, the sky a dull sheet of pewter snow falling softly like flour dusted across a massive wooden table stretched between mountains. Thaddeus Ketteridge stood on the narrow porch of his cabin, boots planted, wide shoulders squared against the cold. At 55, he carried the look of a man shaped by long years of discipline rather than comfort. His frame was still solid, broad through the chest, though time had carved a slight stoop into his spine. His face was angular and weather-cut, with deep lines etched from sun-glare, wind, and nights spent awake. A trimmed salt-and-pepper beard outlined a jaw that had once been sharper, and his gray-blue eyes held a steady, distant alertness, the kind that never fully rests, even in silence. He wore a heavy wool coat faded to the color of old iron. Its elbows patched, its pockets weighted with habit rather than need. People in Gravelow Ridge called him strange, but not dangerous, just distant. The kind of man who nodded once and said nothing more. Behind him, inside the cabin, the smell of pine and iron lingered. Everything in Thad's home was deliberate. Tools hung in straight lines. Firewood was stacked by size and dryness. Each piece split clean ends, pale and dry as bone. Nothing was wasted, nothing was decorative. That order was not preference, it was survival learned the hard way. Muir circled the yard below, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat that darkened along his back like a shadow. His chest was deep legs, powerful movements, economical. His muzzle was already dusted with gray at the edges, not from age alone, but from vigilance. Muir did not bark at passing birds or drifting snow. His ears stood tall, rotating subtly as the wind shifted, nose lifting and lowering as if tasting the morning. When he stopped, it meant something mattered. Thad watched him with the faintest softening at the corners of his eyes. Muir was not trained in the traditional sense anymore, but the instincts never left. The dog had come to Thad as a half-grown animal years ago, skittish ribs showing eyes too sharp for comfort. They had recognized something broken and familiar in each other and decided without ceremony to stay. Down the slope beyond the pines, a movement caught Thad's attention. The Pruitts, new to the ridge, were struggling near their cabin. Ezra Pruitt, a man in his early 30s with a lean build and nervous energy, wrestled with a canvas tarp flapping violently in the wind. His dark hair was perpetually untidy, and his beard grew in uneven patches he never quite managed to trim. He was book-smart, Thad had heard, but untested by mountain winters. His wife Lila stood a few steps back, arms wrapped around herself, her frame slight and tense. She had pale skin that flushed easily in the cold hair, the color of dry wheat tucked beneath a knitted cap. Between them, their small son hovered, boots sinking into the snow, eyes wide, as he watched the tarp snap free and the wind drive snow straight into the stacked logs. The canvas tore loose with a sharp crack. Snow coated the top layer of wood, instantly seeping into the cracks. Ezra swore under his breath, yanking uselessly at the frozen rope. Lila said something Thad couldn't hear, her voice thin with worry. Thad did not smile, though a few others in town might have. He felt no satisfaction, only memory. It rose uninvited, as it often did, when he saw small mistakes cascade toward large consequences. He remembered nights overseas when men laughed off preparations, when equipment checks were rushed, when warnings were dismissed as pessimism. He remembered how quickly humor died, when smoke filled enclosed spaces, when lungs burned and confusion set in. Bullets killed fast, neglect killed quietly. Muir stopped circling and sat, gaze fixed on Thad. The dog tilted his head slightly, ears still forward. It was not a command he waited for, but a question. Thad exhaled slowly, breath blooming white before him. "Yeah," he murmured, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. "I see it." He stepped back inside, moving with purpose, and reached for the old steel sled leaning against the wall. The metal was scarred and rusted in places, its runners worn smooth by years of hauling. He loaded it with an armful of dry split logs, lighter than they looked, each one seasoned properly. Muir rose immediately and took position at his side, tail low, focused. The walk down the slope was quiet, except for the whisper of snow beneath boots and paws. Ezra looked up as Thad approached, surprise flashing across his face, followed quickly by embarrassment. Lila straightened, brushing snow from her sleeves, eyes wary but hopeful. "Morning," Thad said, voice even unhurried. Up close, the lines in his face were more apparent, but so was the calm steadiness that came with them. He did not stare, he did not rush. He simply assessed. Ezra nodded awkwardly. "Didn't think it had come this early," he said, gesturing helplessly at the snow-soaked wood. His tone carried the brittle edge of someone realizing too late that optimism had been misplaced. "It does that here," Thad replied. He set the sled down and began transferring dry logs into Ezra's arms without ceremony. "Use these tonight. Keep the door cracked when you light it. Wet wood smokes." Lila stepped forward, then close enough for Thad to notice the faint, dark circles beneath her eyes. She was tired, afraid. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she took the wood. Ezra hesitated. "We'll pay you back." Thad shook his head once. "Get through the night first." Muir sat near the child, who reached out hesitantly and then froze. The dog did not move, did not lean in, simply waited. After a moment, the boy rested his small hand against Muir's shoulder. The shepherd remained still, eyes half-lidded, accepting the touch like a promise. By the time Thad turned back uphill, the wind had shifted again. Snow thickened. The ridge was already being erased. Familiar shapes softened into indistinct white. He pulled the sled behind him, empty now, but his steps were no lighter. This was not charity, he told himself. It was accounting, a ledger only he kept balanced in firewood and time. Each small act was a repayment toward nights when he had watched smoke take men faster than cold ever could. Behind him, Gravelow Ridge settled into the long quiet of an early winter, unaware that one man had already decided it would not claim another life without resistance. The wind rose before nightfall, not suddenly but with intention, as if the mountains themselves had decided to speak. Snow thickened into long, slanted lines that erased distance and depth, turning Gravelow Ridge into a narrow world of white noise and moving shadow. Thad Ketteridge felt the pressure change in Bams's chest before the first true gust hit the cabin wall, a familiar tightening low in his lungs, where old damage still lived. He paused in the breezeway he had built years earlier, one hand resting on the rough timber post, breathing slow and measured, listening not to the storm but to his body's response to it. The breezeway was not elegant. It was practical to the point of austerity. A long enclosed corridor framed in thick pine beams, roofed with overlapping boards, pitched steep enough to shed snow walls, sealed tight against wind. It connected the cabin's rear door to a narrow storage building that ran parallel to the slope. Inside, the air was dry, faintly warm, and smelled of resin and iron. Firewood lined both sides, stacked with obsessive care, split ends facing outward, each row elevated on sleepers to prevent ground moisture, each piece sorted by density and age. This was not excess. It was foresight shaped by regret. Muir stood at the far end of the corridor, braced, head angled toward the outer door. The German shepherd's coat had already begun to collect static from the dry air, his dark saddle catching the lantern light when Thad lifted it from its hook. Muir's ears flicked once, twice. He did not bark. He never barked at weather. He barked at intent. Thad closed his eyes for a moment as a memory pressed forward, unbidden smoke rolling along a ceiling in a foreign building, men coughing confusion, blooming faster than flame. The injury in his lungs came from a fire that had not looked dangerous until it was too late, a slow choke rather than an explosion. He had survived it. Others had not. Since then, smoke, especially wet smoke, was not an inconvenience to him. It was an enemy that killed quietly. A sound cut through the storm, a sharp, panicked knock carried faintly through the wind. Muir spun, nails scraping once against the wood floor, then sprinted toward the cabin door. Thad was already moving. Ezra Pruitt stood hunched on the porch when Thad opened the door, shoulders dusted, white breath coming in short, ragged pulls. In the lantern light, his face looked drawn and older than it had that morning, beard darkened by meltwater. Behind him, through the open doorway of the Pruitt cabin, smoke rolled thick and gray, heavy enough to sting Thad's eyes from several steps away. "She can't stop coughing," Ezra said, words tumbling over one another. "And the kid, he swallowed hard. I don't know what to do." Thad did not ask questions. He reached into the breezeway, grabbed 2 armfuls of bone-dry wood, and handed one to Ezra while shifting the other under his own arm. "Open every window," he said. "Now, kill the fire. We'll restart clean." Inside the Pruitt cabin, the air was chaos. Lila Pruitt knelt near the hearth, hair loose from its tie, pale face streaked with soot and tears. Her small frame shook as she tried to wave smoke away with a towel, movements frantic and ineffective. On the couch, her son curled inward, coughing so hard his body seemed too small to contain it. Thad moved fast but steady, every motion economical. He dragged the smoldering logs from the hearth, shoveling embers into a metal bucket, and kicked the door wider. Cold air rushed in like a blade, but it cleared the smoke enough for him to see. Muir went straight to the boy, placing his solid weight against the child's legs, grounding him. The dog's presence was calm, deliberate, as if he understood the geometry of panic and knew where to anchor it. Thad waited until the smoke thinned, until Lila's coughing eased from desperate to ragged. Only then did he rebuild the fire using thin kindling, first coaxing flame patiently until it caught clean and bright. The difference was immediate. The fire burned without complaint, heat blooming outward instead of choking back into the room. Lila looked up at him, eyes red but sharp. "Why does it?" she gestured weakly. "Why does it do that?" "Wet wood," Thad said simply, "turns heat into poison." Ezra stared at the hearth as if seeing it for the first time. "We covered it," Thad nodded once. "Covering isn't sealing." The storm worsened outside, the wind rising into a constant howl. When Thad finally stepped back into the night, Muir at his side, he felt the familiar burn in his lungs and welcomed it. Pain meant awareness. Awareness meant survival. He did not make it halfway home before another light cut through the snow, this one unsteady bobbing. A woman stumbled toward him from the direction of the lower ridge road, boots sinking deep. She was tall and thin, wrapped in a threadbare coat that hung awkwardly from narrow shoulders. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver, clung to her face in damp curls. Her skin was weathered, darker than most from years outdoors, and her eyes, sharp, assessing, did not miss the dog at Thad's side or the wood he carried. "Thought I'd find you out here," she said, voice roughened by cold and age. "Storm's got teeth tonight." This was Mara Ellison, a widow in her early 60s, who lived alone farther down the ridge. She walked with a slight limp from an old hip injury sustained years ago when a horse had thrown her. It had never healed right, and the pain had shaped her into a woman who planned every movement and trusted nothing she hadn't tested herself. People said she was difficult. Thad knew better. She was precise. "You shouldn't be out," Thad said. Mara snorted. "Neither should you. My flu's backdrafting. Smoke's coming back down." She glanced at his chest. "You look like hell." "Usually do," he replied. He followed her without comment, the three of them, man, dog, and woman, moving through the storm like figures carved from it. Mara's cabin was smaller than the Pruitts' older built, low to the ground. Inside, the problem was immediately obvious to Thad. Snow had drifted against the chimney outside, blocking the draft. Smoke pooled where it couldn't escape. Thad and Mara worked together without instruction. He cleared the chimney from the outside while she managed airflow inside, windows cracked at precise angles. It was the kind of cooperation born not of friendliness but competence. When the fire finally burned clean, Mara poured them each a cup of bitter coffee, her hands steady now. "You built that corridor for wood," she said, not asking. Thad nodded. "Smart," she said. Then, after a pause, "You know others won't be." He met her gaze. "I know." By the time he returned home, the storm had swallowed the ridge entirely. Snow piled against the breezeway walls, but inside the corridor, the air remained dry and still. Thad stacked replacement wood where it belonged, each piece sliding into place with soft finality. Muir lay down near the door, eyes half closed but alert. That night, Gravelow Ridge slept fitfully. Fires burned badly in some homes, cleanly in others. Smoke hung low in the hollows, and unseen by most, a simple system of sealed wood and protected passage stood ready, not as a monument, but as a quiet refusal to let the storm decide who breathed and who did not. Laughter traveled faster than snow in Gravelow Ridge. It slipped under doors, rode the wind between cabins, settled into kitchens and barns like an uninvited guest. By the second morning after the storm, Thaddeus Ketteridge's name no longer came up with caution. It came with amusement. People spoke it lightly, the way they did when fear had not yet touched them directly. They said he was excessive, overbuilt, that the enclosed breezeway was less a corridor than a tunnel. Someone joked that Thad was preparing for the end of the world instead of a Wyoming winter. Another laughed that a man who lived alone with a dog had too much time and too little sense. The words reached Thad eventually, as words always did, carried by second-hand mouths and sideways glances. He neither denied them nor defended himself. He split wood, he tightened joints, he checked angles. Morning light cut hard across the snow, turning the ridge into a field of white glass. Thad worked without hurry, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that panic wasted energy. He reinforced the roofline of the storage shed, knocking loose ice from the eaves before it could creep backward and force meltwater under the boards. He checked every seam with bare hands, despite the cold feeling for drafts, the way a medic once felt for a pulse. Where the ground dipped, he packed snow flat and laid down boards, creating narrow walkways so older neighbors wouldn't slip. He did not announce the paths. He simply made them. Muir followed him closely, the German shepherd's dark form stark against the brightness. The dog's posture never slackened. His ears tracked movement beyond sight voices down the ridge, the distant creak of trees under load, the subtle wrongness of unstable footing. At one narrow bend near the slope, Muir sat squarely in the middle of the path, refusing to move. When Ezra Pruitt approached carrying a bucket, he laughed despite himself. "Guess he's got traffic control duty," Ezra said. He stepped carefully around the dog, avoiding the patch of ice Muir had silently flagged. Later, Ezra told his wife that the dog might have saved him a broken hip. He laughed again when he said it, but quieter. By afternoon, the cold sharpened. Clouds thickened and the air pressed down heavy and expectant. Thad was fitting new sleepers under a stack of hardwood when he heard boots on the porch. Not hesitant this time. Annoyed. Harlan Greaves stood in the doorway, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched. He was a big man, broad through the chest, though the bulk came more from stubbornness than strength. His beard was thick and uneven dark, with premature gray framing a face perpetually set in a scowl. Harlan was known in Gravelow Ridge for speaking first and thinking later. He had lost part of his left index finger years ago in a logging accident, and the injury had hardened him. Since then, he trusted no solution he hadn't seen fail at least once. "Your dog nearly tripped me," Harlan said by way of greeting. Muir did not move. He only lifted his head and looked at the man with calm, unreadable eyes. "There's ice there," Thad replied. He didn't look up from his work. Harlan shifted, irritation warring with embarrassment. "My tarp collapsed. Snow soaked everything." He hesitated, jaw tightening. "I've got a kid inside, shaking." Thad straightened slowly. His face revealed nothing, no satisfaction, no rebuke. He glanced past Harlan's shoulder and saw the child's small and bundled eyes, too large in a pale face. That was all he needed. "Come in," Thad said. "Take enough for tonight." Harlan blinked. Just like that, Thad met his gaze, then eyes steady, unreadable. Just like that. Inside the storage corridor, the stacks of wood rose clean and orderly, pale ends, aligned, each piece dry enough to ring faintly when tapped together. Harlan reached out almost reverently and lifted a log. His expression changed, not relief, but something closer to disbelief. He turned the wood in his hands, felt the lack of moisture, the lightness. "You build this for everyone?" he asked, voice lower now. "No," Thad said. "I built it so I wouldn't have to watch smoke hurt people." Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it. He took the wood and left without another word. The sun dipped early, swallowed by clouds. Wind rose again, but not with the violence of the night before. This was a holding wind, steady and cold. As dusk settled, more footsteps came, some hesitant, some hurried. Thad did not keep count. He did not ask names. Muir watched them all, silent sentinels stepping forward when someone moved too fast, backing off when fear ebbed. One figure lingered at the edge of the yard longer than the others. A woman, mid-40s perhaps, wrapped in a dark coat worn thin at the elbows. She was of average height, with straight brown hair cut blunt at the jaw, and skin pale from lack of sun. Her posture was careful, guarded. When she finally stepped forward, her voice was quiet but direct. "My name's Celeste Rowan," she said. "I help out at the church pantry." She glanced toward the corridor. "People are talking. Some are scared. Others are proud, I think." Thad nodded once. He did not invite commentary. "They won't say it out loud," Celeste continued, "but they're starting to understand." Understanding was dangerous, Thad thought. It came with expectation. He said nothing. That night the ridge creaked under fresh snow. Fires burned across the valley, some clean, some not. Smoke pooled low where damp wood was still being burned. Thad lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind work against the structure he had built. It held. Always had. Muir slept near the door, one ear, twitching body relaxed but ready. Near midnight, a sound cut through the storm. Not a knock this time, but shouting. Distant, panicked. Muir was up instantly, hackles lifting. Thad pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Down the ridge, a faint orange glow pulsed erratically. Firelight. Too much of it. He moved without conscious thought, sled in hand, Muir already racing ahead. The Greaves cabin was chaos. Someone had tried to dry wet wood too close to the stove. A spark had jumped. Flames licked up the wall, fast and hungry. Harlan stood frozen, shouting for water. His earlier bravado burned away. Thad acted. He smothered flames with heavy wool blankets, hauled the burning wood outside, dumped snow with ruthless efficiency. Muir barked once, sharp, commanding, driving the child farther back away from smoke. When it was over, the cabin stood blackened but intact. The fire had been stopped before it could take the roof. Harlan slumped against the wall, hands shaking, face ashen. "I thought I could manage it," he said hoarsely. Thad crouched, breath burning in his chest. "Most people do." Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers and the wind. Around them, neighbors gathered, faces, pale, eyes wide. Laughter was gone now, replaced by something heavier, respect, perhaps, or fear finally understood. Thad turned away before it could settle on him. He did not want their gratitude. Gratitude turned into dependence. Dependence made people careless again. As he walked back uphill, Muir fell into step beside him, tail low steady. Behind them, Gravelow Ridge stood quieter than it had all day. People would talk again tomorrow, but they would talk differently. And beneath the talk, a truth had taken root. Preparation was not paranoia. It was mercy delivered before disaster asked for it. The blizzard arrived without a moon, the kind of night where darkness felt heavy enough to press against the ribs. Wind poured down from the high ridges like surf crashing through a narrow channel, and the snow came sideways, relentless, thick enough that sound itself seemed buried. By dawn, Gravelow Ridge no longer looked like a place people lived. It looked abandoned, erased by white. Roads vanished first. Then the power lines went quiet. A clean snap somewhere down valley, followed by a hush that made the wind seem louder. Inside cabins, lights flickered out one by one. Radios died, phones went dark. What remained was fire breath and the judgment people made when fear narrowed their choices. By mid-morning, smoke lay low across the ridge. Some families burned green wood out of desperation. Others fed old furniture to their stoves, chairs, warped planks, anything that would catch. The smoke thickened, damp and sour, creeping into lungs already strained by cold. Older residents began to wheeze. Thad Ketteridge could hear it even from his porch, that muffled coughing carried on the wind. It pulled at his chest like a hand. He stood still for a long moment, shoulders squared, feeling the old scar in his lungs flare, as if to remind him of the cost of hesitation. Going house to house was no longer possible. The drifts were waist-high in places, chest-high in others, and even if he could reach them, he would never reach all of them in time. Thad turned back toward the storage shed, boots crunching through packed snow. Muir followed close, thick coat rimed with ice eyes, bright and alert. The dog's presence steadied the pace the way it always had. Thad opened the wide double doors and looked at the rows of wood he had stacked over years, oak, birch, pine, each pile sorted, each piece dry enough to burn clean even in this weather. He made a decision then, not loudly, not ceremonially, but with the quiet finality of a promise remembered. He hauled the white canvas from the corner, shook it once, and tied it above the entrance where it would be visible even through the storm. Against the blowing snow it glowed stark and unmistakable, a signal, not of distress but of presence. Inside the shed, Thad cleared a space near the wall and set a steel fire barrel on a stone base. Its vent pipe angled safely through a gap in the roof. He lit a small, disciplined fire, no roaring flames, just enough heat to take the edge off the cold and dry, wet hands. He laid out measured bundles of wood along the wall, each stack marked with a simple chalk line, portions, not hoards. Muir took position at the threshold, sitting squarely in the doorway. The German shepherd's posture was unmistakable, calm, immovable, watchful. His ears flicked at every sound, but he did not bark. When someone approached too fast, he stood. When they slowed, he sat again. It was as if the dog understood the shape of order better than any person present. The first to arrive was Mara Ellison, tall and spare, dark hair pulled back tight against the wind, her limp more pronounced in the deep snow. Her lined face looked paler than usual, eyes sharp despite the cold. She nodded once when she saw the white canvas. "You always did think ahead," she said. There was no humor in it now, only relief. Behind her came Ezra and Lila Pruitt, faces drawn, their son wrapped in too many layers and clutching a scarf. Ezra's earlier bravado was gone, replaced by something humbler. He said nothing, only accepted the wood Thad handed him and mouthed a thank you. Lila met Thad's eyes for a heartbeat longer, her expression a mixture of gratitude and dawning understanding. This wasn't luck. This was preparation. Word spread fast, carried by necessity rather than gossip. People came in ones and twos, then in small groups, moving carefully through the snow, guided by the white canvas and the faint glow within the shed. Thad did not ask names. He watched hands. Shaking hands got first choice of the warmer bundles. He did not lecture. He pointed, measured, nodded. Muir enforced the rest, blocking anyone who tried to take more than marked stepping aside when Thad nodded approval. No one argued with the dog. As night fell again, the shed filled with the quiet sounds of survival boots, stamping breath fogging the soft clack of wood being stacked into arms. The small fire crackled its sound sharp and clean, nothing like the choking roar of damp fuel. People spoke in low voices, not out of fear but respect, as if loud words might break the fragile balance holding the storm at bay. Near the back wall, Thad leaned against a post weight, settling into his heels. The ache in his lungs had softened, replaced by a familiar fatigue that came after purpose. In the popping of the dry wood, he heard echoes of other nights, other fires, other men. This time the memory did not claw. It loosened like a knot finally easing. Close to midnight, a figure pushed through the snow at the edge of the light, moving with urgency that bordered on panic. He was younger than most who had come late 20s, perhaps, with a narrow build and a face too pale for the cold. His hair was light brown, plastered to his forehead, with sweat despite the temperature, and his eyes darted constantly. He wore no gloves. "My father," he blurted. "He can't breathe." "We tried." His voice broke. Thad straightened at once. Where lower ridge, past the old fence. Muir was on his feet before Thad could finish nodding. The dog moved ahead, cutting a path through the snow with instinctive certainty. Thad grabbed a canvas sack of the driest wood, slung it over his shoulder, and followed. The cabin was nearly buried, only the roofline visible. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, heavy and wet. An older man lay propped against the wall chest, heaving skin gray. Thad acted without thought, opening windows, killing the smoldering fire, clearing space. He rebuilt the hearth with thin, dry splits, coaxing a clean flame while the younger man fanned fresh air. Muir pressed close to the older man's legs, grounding him steady as a rock. It took time, too much time, but the breathing eased, the coughing slowed, the color returned faint but real. When it was over, the younger man sank to the floor, hands shaking. Thad packed the remaining wood neatly by the hearth. "Burn this," he said. Nothing else. Back at the shed, the line had thinned. People took what they needed and left quietly, the white canvas fluttering above them like a benediction. Thad closed the doors only when the storm began to break the wind, easing into a long, exhausted sigh. Just before dawn, Celeste Rowan appeared, coat pulled tight, cheeks flushed from cold. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene, the orderly stacks, the cleared path, the dog still on watch. "They're calling it your depot," she said softly. Thad shook his head. "It's a door." Celeste smiled faintly. Doors change things. When the first pale light crept over Gravelow Ridge, the storm finally loosened its grip. Snow lay deep, but the air was clearer. Smoke thinned. Fires burned better. Thad untied the white canvas and folded it carefully, hands slow, deliberate. Muir relaxed at last, curling near the doorway, eyes closing. Thad looked out across the ridge, the quiet after the storm settling in his bones. He had made a promise long ago to himself, to the men who hadn't come home, that if he ever found a way to keep the invisible enemy at bay, he would not turn from it. Tonight he had kept that promise, not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. The storm withdrew the way exhausted armies do, without ceremony, leaving behind scars and silence. Gravelow Ridge woke to a brightness that felt unfamiliar, sunlight glancing off snowdrifts like polished steel. Smoke rose thinner now, more honest, and the wind moved with less menace, as if it had spent itself proving a point. Paths appeared where none had existed days earlier, narrow channels carved by boots and sleds connecting homes that had survived the long white night together. Thaddeus Ketteridge did not step outside at first. He stood in the breezeway, hands wrapped around a tin mug, listening to the subtle changes in the air. The pressure in his chest had eased. Not vanished old injuries did not grant that mercy, but softened enough to let him breathe without calculation. Muir lay nearby, stretched out with a sigh that came from deep in his ribs, his thick black and tan coat shedding clumps of melting snow. The German shepherd's eyes followed the light as it moved across the floor, no longer sharp with vigilance, just present. When Thad finally opened the doors, the day greeted him with small human sounds. Laughter, the scrape of shovels, someone singing badly and not caring who heard. Gravelow Ridge looked battered, but it was standing. The Pruitts arrived mid-morning, boots, cleaned coats, brushed as best as they could manage. Lila carried a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, its warmth seeping through her gloves. She looked less hollow than she had before the storm, her pale skin touched with color, her posture straighter. Ezra followed a step behind, beard, trimmed unevenly, eyes still cautious but steadier. Their son held the bread as if it were a fragile treasure, glancing at Muir with shy reverence. "We made it with what we had," Lila said, offering the loaf. But it tasted better, knowing why. Thad accepted it with a nod, no false modesty, no speech. He sliced the bread later and shared it with neighbors who drifted by, each piece eaten slowly, as if people were learning again how to savor what lasted. Harlan Greaves came that afternoon, hat in hand, his broad shoulders rounded not by cold, but by something closer to humility. He looked different still, imposing, still sharp-edged, but quieter, as if the fire that nearly took his home had burned something else away. His thick beard was streaked with ash he hadn't managed to wash out completely, a reminder he did not try to hide. "I need to know how you stack it," Harlan said, gesturing toward the wood. "Not the theory, the way you actually do it." Thad did not gather an audience. He picked up a split log, showed how to elevate it, how to leave space for air, how to read the grain and decide where it belonged. He pointed to the vents he'd cut, the angles that deflected wind instead of inviting it. He spoke little. He let the work speak. Harlan watched closely, nodding once, twice, memorizing with the seriousness of a man who had learned the cost of guessing. Others followed. Mara Ellison arrived with a thermos and sharp questions about chimney height and snow load. Celeste Rowan came with a notebook she barely used, choosing instead to watch how Thad moved, how Muir anticipated him. Even Noah Hale, pale but steadier now, stopped by briefly, eyes full of gratitude he did not voice. Thad kept his answers precise and brief. He did not correct people publicly. He corrected structures. The days lengthened by minutes at a time. Snow softened. Beneath it, earth reappeared in dark, damp patches. Children tested the ground with sticks. Dogs ran without slipping. Winter loosened its grip, not defeated but negotiated with. By late February, the conversation shifted. They were no longer about survival, but about improvement. How to make the next storm less costly. How to share work before it became emergency. A few families began building their own enclosed corridors, their own versions of Thad's practical passage. They asked permission. He waved it off. They asked for names. He shrugged. Names invited ownership. Ownership invited pride. Pride was a poor insulator. Thad watched it all with a careful distance. He helped when asked. He declined when not. He did not attend meetings, but his work attended for him. Muir became a fixture wherever wood was stacked or roofs reinforced his presence, a quiet endorsement. The dog aged visibly through the season gray, spreading along his muzzle, but his stride remained sure. He ran on melting snow and wet earth alike, his tracks crossing paths that had once been isolated. One evening, as the ridge blushed with the first hints of spring, Thad stood at the edge of his property and watched Muir race through slush and shadow. The dog skidded, recovered, barked once in sheer joy, and kept going. Thad smiled, a small private thing. He remembered another winter, another place where laughter had felt like a betrayal of loss. This laughter did not feel that way. It felt earned. Celeste joined him, then hands in her pockets, breath visible, but no longer strained. "They're not calling you strange anymore," she said lightly. "I never asked them to stop." Thad replied. "They didn't," she said. "They learned." That night, Thad sat alone with the fire low, listening to the clean crack of dry wood. The sound carried him back not to the fire that had scarred his lungs, but to the promise he'd made afterward, lying in a hospital bed, with the smell of antiseptic and smoke still haunting his breath. He had promised that if he ever found a way to make danger smaller, he would. He had promised to act early quietly before heroics were required. Gravelow Ridge did not need a hero. It needed preparation. It needed someone willing to build warmth before the cold demanded it. Thad understood now that redemption did not arrive as applause or absolution. It arrived as function, as systems that worked when people faltered, as dogs that sat where ice hid, as bread shared without speeches. Spring came in pieces, a day without frost, a creek running louder, the smell of wet pine. Families finished their corridors and storage sheds, each different, each better than nothing. They did not copy Thad exactly. He was glad of that. Adaptation meant understanding. On the last cold morning of the season, Thad folded the white canvas and stored it away. He did not know if it would be needed again. He hoped not. Hope, he had learned, was not a plan, but it was allowed now. Muir lay at his feet as Thad closed the doors for the evening, the dogs breathing slow and even. Outside, Gravelow Ridge settled into a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by fear of winter, but by readiness for it. People passed Thad on the road and nodded, a simple gesture unadorned. It carried no debt. It carried thanks enough. Thad lifted his mug and listened to the fire one last time that night. The flame held steady, not roaring, not struggling. He understood then that winter had not been defeated. It had been understood, and understanding shared early had changed everything. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive as thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes as dry wood stacked before winter, a steady hand in the dark, a dog that sits where danger hides, and a heart that chooses to prepare rather than panic. God's grace often moves this way, quiet, practical, almost invisible, until the moment it saves a life. In Thad's story, no angel descended from the sky. No voice spoke from the storm. Yet grace was present all the same. It was present in foresight, in restraint, in compassion given before it was demanded. Scripture reminds us that faith without works is dead, and love is proven not by words, but by action. What Thad built was not just a shelter from snow, it was obedience to a calling he didn't fully understand, only felt. In our daily lives, we are given the same choice. We can wait for crisis, or we can prepare, we can pass by, or we can step forward quietly. We can hoard warmth, or we can share it. You may never face a blizzard in the mountains, but someone near you is facing a storm you cannot see. Fear, loneliness, exhaustion, grief. A kind word, a prepared heart, a steady presence may be the miracle God chooses to send through you. If this story moved you, let it move outward. Share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or your own story. Your words may comfort another soul. And if you believe in stories that remind us of faith, kindness, and quiet courage, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these messages reach those who need them most. May God bless you and your family. May He keep your home warm, your heart steady, and your path lit even in the longest winter. And may you recognize the miracles that arrive not with noise, but with love prepared in advance.